How should social media marketers establish, monitor, and measure their disclosure policies and practices? Well, WOMMA, the Word of Mouth Marketing Association, has recently published an important update to their social media marketing disclosure guide. And we've got a video panel discussion of industry experts to provide their insights on how this can affect your business as a brand or as a social media marketer. That's what's next on WOMMA TV. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for a conversation about WOMMA's newly updated social media disclosure guide. Joining me on today's video panel discussion to fill in the details about the new guide are Tom Chernaik, CEO of Comply, Malcolm Faulds, Senior Vice President of Marketing at BzzAgent, and Tony DiResta, Partner at Winston and Strawn. Welcome guys.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Hi there.
So let's start with the original purpose of this guide. This is a newly published version of it, an update that's important for everyone to look at, but who's it for, what will they learn, and why is this important? Tom, can you start us off?
Sure. The guide was originally released around the release of the FTC's guide for testimonials and endorsements. And the goal was to give agencies and brands a real sense of what they should be doing and to inform the influencers themselves of what kinds of disclosure requirements were there, what they needed to do, what would be sufficient in order to make these kinds of disclosures in actual use. And what's happened is over time, that was originally released it was worked on in 2008, it was released officially in 2009. In the years that followed, there were obviously a lot of changes in the space, and platforms like Facebook and Twitter that have developed in many new ways, as well as things like Pinterest and Instagram that didn't even exist back then, that today are playing a much bigger role in marketing. So we realized, and Malcolm and I are the co-chairs of the Members Ethics Advisory Panel, we realized that there was a real need in the market for people to not only have an update on what's been going on, but a refresher, really understanding what responsibilities they had, who was responsible for these things, and what they do in such a rapidly changing environment, what they need to do and what they need to think of as they're building these programs in social and digital marketing.
So obviously the world and the technology and the way people use tools, they're all changing, it's all evolving. But is this guide basically something that every social media marketer or brand has to look at? Like, is this document effectively table stakes for playing in this space? Malcolm, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Yeah, I think that at a high level, yes. I think if you're going to do social marketing, social media, advertising, or any of those things, you should be looking at this document. The FTC was pretty high level in its guidance and taught theoretically and a little bit abstractly. And I think what we've tried to do here is make it more concrete, make it more real for marketers, make it a little bit more actionable. So we've included a lot of definitions. In the original guide that we did a couple of years ago, we talked about bloggers and marketers, the same terminology that the FTC uses. We thought it would be helpful to break that down a little bit more and talk into detail about what brand advocates are, whether they're affiliated brand advocates like employees or partners, or if they're independent advocates, people who are just customers who really like a certain product. We also talked about things like Facebook likes, which weren't around when we originally did the guidance. These kinds of signs of approval where disclosure isn't always possible. These are important terminology definitions that we wanted to make sure marketers knew about. We also want to be very broad in the examples that we were giving. There's been such a proliferation of platforms and social media that we needed to talk to Twitter, we needed to talk to Facebook, blogs, of course, because there's been a lot of evolution there, but also things like online review platforms, online video or photo sharing sites, affiliate networks, podcasts, all the rest. So I would say people who are professionals in social media work across all these different platforms, and they work in lots of different scenarios in these platforms. They should, at a minimum, be familiar with this guide so that they are steering clear of any trouble they might get into.
Well, and I mean, we talk about like the FTC, obviously these guys you said that a lot of their legalese, and it was a little bit vague in some cases, or not easy and accessible. Or Tony, what is the FTC's response to WOMMA's guide in this recent update?
Curtis, the response has been very positive, and it's good to note that WOMMA's developed a lot of credibility with the FTC in terms of what it's trying to do for self-regulation and developing best practices. I think a good starting point is to look at some of the history here. Back in 2009, the FTC came out with their guides on testimonials and endorsements that Tom referenced. But prior to their coming out with those guides, there was a submission of comments by many trade associations and many speakers. And what WOMMA did in their submission of comments talked about the WOMMA Code of Ethics and standards of conduct. And when the FTC came out with their guides, in their publication, they actually applauded WOMMA's efforts in their Code of Ethics, saying, yes, these are the kinds of practices marketers, agents, and speakers need to comply with to be in compliance with the FTC law. And what we have now in these disclosure guidelines is a continuation of that effort in terms of self-regulation. And why I believe that the FTC is really applauding WOMMA's efforts is that the heart of the FTC laws on whatever media you're using, be it television, radio, print, or social media, there's really 4 guiding posts that are essential. One is transparency, that is the disclosure of material connections so that the consumer can make an informed decision, know who is behind the communication. The second is you want your communications to be accurate. You want everything to be truthful, not misleading. Third, you want your communications to be honest, that the speaker is just not a puppet for the marketer. And fourth is respect. There's intellectual property rights involved in speech, and you want to be sure to recognize that. And so these guides honor these 4 principles, and I think that lies at the heart of why the FTC is applauding WOMMA's efforts.
So from the point of view of these changes and disclosure practices and so forth, how is the new guide basically defining the roles of the different players? We've got the marketer, we've got the advocate, we've got all these different characters that are kind of outlined. Malcolm, do you want to speak to how that's basically reflected in the guide and what people should specifically be listening to?
Sure. We're really pushing for better training across the board. So brands and agencies are clear what they're responsible for, but also so that they're more effective at training brand advocates and what's expected of them. So I think that's essentially what we were trying to accomplish with this guide. So we wanted to be clear with agencies and brands that they're responsible for what happens in their programs. It's not just, the responsibility doesn't just lie with the advocates. And so to that end, brands and agencies need to train advocates about what disclosure is and how to do it. They need to be clear about what fair and accurate product claims are. And they need to comply with any social media policies that have been established by the brand or are in effect for certain marketing promotions.
And obviously, every marketer, every ad agency, every creative person wants to be able to have like complete freedom to do their thing creatively. What kind of blowback are we hearing from the creative community or even the brands about some of the restrictions on including links or content or textual information in some of this creative? Maybe you can talk about that, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, there's often some pushback on the creative side that in disclosing a relationship, that it will take the creative nature out of the communication. And let's be clear that it's not an option to disclose. It's if you're running a program like this, there is a requirement that you make a disclosure and that you do it in a meaningful way. So the creatives have to find a way to work with it. But what we found is that it isn't hampering the creative process in any way. And in fact, making that disclosure brings through, it shines through the trust and responsibility that a brand has. And helps them better communicate within these channels. The other piece that's important to note that's been drawn out in this process is that we always talked a lot about the monitoring requirements that brands have to monitor these programs to make sure that the disclosures that they've asked for are actually being done. But those weren't properly reflected in the guide that WOMMA had initially released. So one of the updates, based on some of the cases that have been settled with the FTC, we felt that it was important to really draw that out. So that was one of the real highlights of the updated guidance.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that talks to kind of like, the responsibilities on the different players within the system. But really, what does it come down to? Like, what's at stake here? What is the risk of not understanding these disclosure responsibilities and kind of operating in the dark? Are these kind of mistakes fixable if they do happen? Are they big mistakes, little mistakes? How serious are they? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Tony.
Curtis, sure. Let me start by picking on something in the monitoring piece that Tom and Malcolm talked about. When the FTC looks at, policies and procedures of compliance, they look at it from three levels, not just from one set of lens. The first is, do you have the social media policy? But then number two, has it been implemented? Have you appropriately educated your speakers, your employees, et cetera? But then number three, is it effective? Are your policies and practices effective? The only way to drill down on that is to see if you've got an adequate monitoring program. So I really applaud the efforts of what MEEP and WOMMA has done in emphasizing those monitoring efforts. And to your question as to risks, I think there's the first very important, perhaps the most important consideration from a business implication, is that if you don't disclose appropriately, if you don't follow these guidelines, it's going to impact the brand. You can lose consumer trust. And that's obviously, no marketer wants that to happen. But then there's, of course, the threat of law enforcement investigations by the Federal Trade Commission or even by a state attorney general. And then finally, depending upon the nature of the advertising campaign, how these, where do these social media platforms play in? It could be part of a litigation in terms of false advertising. So the risks are really there. I'll turn it over now for Tom to talk about, the fixes and what a company can do to try to be proactive about this.
Well, and Tom, just to preface what you're saying, I mean, obviously you guys are focused on the compliance element of this. Within the public issuer space or public companies, a lot of them have a compliance officer. We have community managers now within social media. Are we going to have compliance managers or compliance officers in the future?
Yeah, and just to be clear, the primary concern, obviously, there is always the threat of the FTC or the state attorney general, coming after somebody, in a more legal sense. But where we often see the problems begin is in the court of public opinion. And what happens is somebody picks up on it, somebody thinks that something doesn't seem right, they'll write about it, they'll talk about it. In some cases, that will get picked up in the press. And then from there, it can snowball. And in fact, in all of the examples that we've seen come out of the FTC, those have started with the court of public opinion and then grown in size. So it's important to not only think about the consequences of an FTC investigation, which is very real, but that you want to stem the tide long before, and you want to avoid the public backlash, not only because it could lead to further legal trouble, but even more so because you want to protect the trust and reputation that the brand has that is so difficult to build in the first place. And to your question about the compliance officer, yes, I mean, we started Comply, almost 3 years ago. And in the beginning, we saw that there were compliance officers at most of the larger financial institutions, most of the larger, sort of traditionally regulated industries, health, pharma, things like that. But what we've seen is a huge increase, not only at brands, but even at agencies, where agencies, and in particular agencies in the social space, have started hiring people who are not only have a legal background, but who are specifically focused on compliance and making sure that whether it's investor relations compliance that you mentioned, FTC compliance that we're talking about here, or other areas, obviously including all of that legal language, all of the disclosures, all of the explanations of what you do becomes incredibly challenging when you're limited to a Facebook post or a tweet, both in number of characters and space to actually say something. So there are a number of ways, and that's really what we've highlighted in the update, is a number of ways that you can think about making those disclosures clear and ensuring that those processes are both in place and actually being implemented in your programs, and when you have third-party agencies or other influencers who are speaking on your behalf.
So we're going to put a link at the bottom of the video here, and we'll include it in the text as well. If anybody wants to download the newly updated version of this, they can do so off the WOMMA site at womma.org/ethics/disclosure. WOMMA also has its national summit coming up in November from the 12th to the 14th, which is kind of their big event during the year. I guess the issue is who should attend this event? You know, what are some of the cool things that WOMMA is going to be doing this year at the summit? Malcolm, do you want to throw in on this one?
Yeah, we've been taking a look at ethics internationally. So we have some great resources for marketers for larger multinational companies, but also perhaps agencies that operate in different markets. So that if you are doing programs in Asia and want to understand what the guidelines are, the regulating bodies in Asia, you know, we have a resource that you can learn about there, and we have special sessions that are relevant to international marketers. Or if you perhaps are based in the US, but you're running programs in Europe, the UK, and perhaps South America, again, we have resources that are relevant to you and sessions where you can learn about issues in those markets and even meet fellow marketers from those markets. So we love the international aspect of WOMMA.
Well, and also too, you've got a lot of kind of cool case studies. I mean, you get to meet a lot of your peers that you never get the chance to kind of connect with necessarily, especially within your industry. A lot of these things are specific for a lot of people to kind of connect and empathize, as well as learn and share a lot of good practices for what makes, you know, their brands better online.
That's right.
So guys, thanks so much for making today's discussion so good and expanding on the details of what the guide is going to do. And obviously this is ever evolving, so we're going to be able to see lots more, I guess, in the future from this guide.
Absolutely, and at Summit itself, we'll have a session that specifically dives into more of this conversation, and we look forward to having each of you join that conversation as well.
Tony, Malcolm, Tom, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for putting it together.
If you'd like more information about WOMMA or about the recent disclosure guide, please visit womma.org. And please show your support by liking or sharing this video within your own professional networks. I'm Curtis Hollister. Thanks so much for watching this episode of WOMMA TV.